Hello and welcome to this special edition of Suits and Boots, the TDI Sustainability podcast series in conjunction with the Investing in African Mining Indaba. In this series, speakers at the 2026 Mining Indaba event discuss some of the key themes that will be covered at that conference. I'm Stewart Carter, Executive Chair at TDI Sustainability, and joining me for today's discussion is Paul Baruya, who is the Director of Strategy and Sustainability at FutureCoal, about which we'll hear a little more later. But first, a big welcome, Paul.
Thank you, Ashen. Pleasure to be here.
So as global energy priorities shift, coal is re-entering the conversation in Africa, or perhaps it's never left that conversation, and raises complex questions around investment, sustainability, and energy equity. So in this episode, Paul, we're going to discuss whether renewed coal investment is real, what clean coal means in practice, and how coal may fit within just energy transition commitments. But to start, Paul, could you tell us a little bit about FutureCoal and about your journey to your position at FutureCoal?
Of course. FutureCoal is actually what we're formerly known as the World Coal Association. We rebranded back in 2023. FutureCoal has been going on if you like, the actual history of FutureCoal is actually much longer than the brand suggests. And where we used to be an industry association for the coal mining sector, we felt that we had to broaden and unite the entire value chain. So really it was to extend that conversation and extend our advocacy to beyond just mining, but to also embrace the end users as well, such as the power utilities, engaging with the steel sector, engaging with the cement sector, and all the others and all the innovators who are producing all these new fantastic minerals and materials at universities around the world using coal. So we really wanted to bring that to the fore and really increase the consciousness of the value, the strategic value of coal today, as well as in the past, but also where we might see this value going in the future. And it's really exciting. So my own background really comes from an energy policy master's degree from Imperial College in London. And that's where I got inspired by clean coal technology. Now, I know the word clean coal can grate some people, but really that's what it was called. And that inspired me, and that was back in the 1990s. And then I've also had a background in the IEA clean coal technology, which was known back then, which then evolved into the Centre for Sustainable Carbon, where I learned about the trends for all these new coal innovations and coal market directions. And so it was really exciting to see the whole plethora of solutions for coal. But I've also had a background in environmental technology as well, environmental consultancy. And that was with one of the UK's largest consultancy firms, where I created the methodology to create CO2 allowance allocations to UK industry. And I also spent several years in energy forecasting. So I used to look at global coal, gas, oil, and prices as well, and at all power generation trends. So really, I really enjoyed the multi-fuel side of analysing the sort of the global patterns and trying to understand how does the world of energy work. And that really drove me to that. And what brought me to FutureCoal was to continue that work, but realising that really, we need to find fossil fuel solutions, and that's something we'll talk about a bit later. And that's where the advocacy work really is coming from in FutureCoal, and it's called Sustainable Coal Stewardship. But we can describe that a little later.
That's great, and that's a fascinating journey, and clearly you have a very appropriate, and you're very well qualified, have a very well qualified resume for the job. You mentioned a little bit there, and on the FutureCoal website, it talks, I think, about addressing the misconceptions around coal. And, I think it's fair to say coal's had a bad rap, from whether it's kind of human rights associated with coal mining or how it's burned and what's the contribution to the climate change, of the negative effects of climate change. But what I think you're bringing up is this isn't really the way to be looking at coal at all. So from your vantage point, the vantage point of FutureCoal, How would you describe the current global conversation around coal, and how has that changed, and where is it heading now?
Yeah, I think it's had a bad rap, and there is some justification behind it because maybe the practices in the 20th century weren't up to modern ESG standards, and also that goes with the end users. But things have changed and things have moved on, and I think what we see in the West is what we see in terms of coal in the past. For instance, one's image based in London, one's image of the coal industry is somewhat different to the way it's operating in Asia today, for instance. But what we have now seen very recently is this conversation leading us towards a more modern coal realism. Not the fact that it's not going to go away, it's always going to be there, but rather it is here today. So how can we make today's practice and tomorrow's practice more sustainable? And we're actually seeing those solutions emerging all around the world, and it's really exciting to see that. The debate has also shifted from just phasing out coal, which has obviously been the core since 2015, to actually understanding energy security. And since COVID and since the Russian energy sanctions and all the geopolitical tensions associated with everything going around the world, I think we're now seeing nations and countries looking inward and thinking, how do we protect ourselves in terms of energy security? Because energy security leads to national security. And so it's all about building resilience within the economy. And where coal exists today, and where it hasn't been phased out, it's actually being reassessed now. And we're seeing that in India, China, Asia, Africa, and Australia, and of course the United States. Now, India and China isn't really going through quite as rapid pace of transition, nor is Southeast Asia. But they are going through a transition nonetheless. But what they're not doing is immediately jumping on the bandwagon to phase out coal anytime soon.
Yes, thank you for those reflections on coal in the context of national sustainable development, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But panning out a little bit to the global discourse, if you're not talking about artificial intelligence at a dinner party nowadays, you're talking about critical minerals. Should coal be on one of these critical minerals lists?
Well, in some respects it is. Coking coal, which as a coal is used for processes rather than for combustion, is considered a critical mineral, rather a critical raw material in many parts of the world. South Africa is one. The US see it as, even Europe sees coking coal, as a critical raw material. And it is formally on their list. But I think traditionally when we think of critical minerals, we think of all the ones that go in electronics and electric motors, as you say, rightly, AI, but also the critical minerals that are needed to supply the solar and wind industry with what they need in order to operate. And even coal and gas plants still need them. But the quantities required for wind and solar for the sort of trajectory we're seeing is absolutely huge. So when we now turn to the question of shouldn't coal be a critical mineral, well, no fossil fuels are actually considered critical minerals or critical materials, as in thermal coal for power generation or for the cement sector. It's generally excluded. So when we talk about criticality, let's now sort of re-envisage the question and think, well, what would happen if you strip thermal coal from the world economy? Would you suddenly reach a sort of a catastrophic point of, sort of market collapses and things like that? Well, when you consider that 70% of world steel is produced from coking coal, when you think that cement, almost 80% of cement requires coal for its production, 30% of global electricity comes from coal, admittedly geographically over in Asia. But also coal plays an absolutely vital role in regions like Africa, where it acts as not only a core source of electricity, particularly in South Africa, but it also has a tempering effect on the massive volatility one can see historically in the gas and oil markets, and also has a tempering effect on the volatility of intermittent renewable energies on the grid system. So it has, although it seems to be a marginal fuel in the eyes of, particularly in the eyes of the Westerners, it is still an absolutely vital material. And so I think the answer to the question is yes, it is critical, as is gas in many parts of the world, as is oil in many parts of the world. But it's just all about perception and what do we see as critical? Does it have an impact on industry? Does it have an effect on the achieving developments in crucial, regions of the world? If I give you an example, that China brought 600 million people out of poverty, 600 million since the late 20th century. That's about the amount of people that are actually in energy poverty today. And that was done with coal as a key underpinning of its economy and economic development. Now, imagine if you then took coal out of South Africa, you're not only going to strip South Africa of an absolutely vital fuel for not only for gasification, for chemicals and fertilizers and other productions like that, but you've obviously got your power generation. But imagine you then suddenly took that from the Southern African power pool. All of your members who rely on coal as a marginal fuel, at least, and particularly when there are hydro droughts, they're all going to suffer. The entire region's going to feel a massive, massive pinch. It's a vital part of all the economies in order to enable them to keep their economic activities going. So one could argue if coal is not a critical mineral, it's definitely a critical resource for the region.
Just to unpack that a little bit more, just so I got it clear in my head. So the coking coal, which some people call steel-making coal, is really, I think, is a critical input to the clean energy transition. That's how people normally phrase the critical minerals, because it's needed for this infrastructure material and for casings and for wind turbines and pretty much everything else. And we're going to hear a little bit about kind of green coal. Now, do we think, could you give some facts about how coking coal, steel-making coal will persist? I went to a meeting at the Austrian embassy a couple of weeks ago in London, and they're talking about the green steel there and the advent not just of arc furnaces but also hydrogen as well in the system. But just give us a little idea about what is needed for steel going forward, and then on the thermal side, which isn't used for steel making, how that's important and global. Just some facts and figures would be really useful.
Sure. Well, at the moment, roughly 70% of the world steel production comes from blast furnaces, and so that is primarily using coking coal and iron ore. Now, the notion that these are going to transition to electricity and to hydrogen-based is an interesting one. Now, the electric arc furnace, the EAF process, which effectively uses electrodes and uses, as the name suggests, electricity to produce steel, relies almost entirely on scrap steel. So you've got a secondary market of scrap metal that needs to feed into it. So most of the sort of iron ore requirements then isn't needed. But then what you do need is you need a sophisticated and absolutely abundant scrap steel source. So it's not always that straightforward to transition over. The last time I looked at the market, the electric arc furnaces also were of a much smaller scale, which made them actually more popular. If you look at the numbers, because they were smaller scale, they could be situated in more places. So they look apparently as though it's really the way to go forward, but there are still ramifications regarding where do you get the raw materials for it. Also, of course, you need affordable electricity. So where you may have abundant hydro or maybe nuclear power, that's great. Where you've got an abundance of fossil fuel-based thermal power generation, that works really, really well also. So there are so many other factors involved in the electric process. The hydrogen process is also interesting. The source of the hydrogen is a big question. When one has conversations in Europe, it's always about green hydrogen, which I think it's coming from a good place. I'm not going to contest that. But all that hydrogen right now is coming. If you want to get it from wind and solar, you are looking at several multiples the cost of the current source of hydrogen, which is actually natural gas and a little bit of coal. And much of that being produced in China. So there is a cost factor with the hydrogen. And also, somebody spoke at a meeting a few years ago, and they were saying that if you converted all of the steelmaking capabilities in Europe to hydrogen, you would need nearly all the electricity in Europe to create the hydrogen using the electrolysis process, just to replace the steel. So, that kind of gives you some perspective on the challenges involved. That's not to say that there isn't a way forward. There's definitely so much investment going into those and so much innovation going into those. The key thing is how do you make the hydrogen a lot cheaper? And on the thermal coal question, pardon me, roughly 30% of world electricity generation still comes from coal. And going back to your comment about the life cycle, not only is the coal-based steel absolutely vital to make affordable steel for wind turbines and so on and so forth, you also need the affordable electricity as well to really run those manufacturing plants in China to produce the solar panels. Well, not so much as the panels as themselves, but to produce the solar, like the modules and the purification of the silicon, as well as all the critical minerals that are going in to produce the abundant electric motors, generators that sit inside the nacelles of the wind turbines at the top. If I gave you an idea that roughly the amount to produce a megawatt of installed capacity for wind and solar, you need roughly 3 to 6 times more critical minerals than you do for building a megawatt of a gas plant or a coal plant. So, the scale of what we need is absolutely gigantic. And in terms of coal and power, well, coal is still underpinning a lot of electricity markets and grids around the world. The US most recently in the last winter relied on coal for many of the grids. Up to 40% of the electricity came from coal at the most crucial times when there was very little wind, solar and gas available and there was peak demand. So we're seeing this not so much as a resurgence, but a recognition that coal is a absolutely necessary part of the of grid security. In Australia, we're seeing some coal plants which were earmarked for imminent closure, which will have their lives extended by a few years. So we're starting to see around the world as some need for coal still. I think there are some countries in Europe which are on the cusp, but they are kind of legally bound by much, much tighter regulations in terms of targets. So it's a lot harder for them to try and keep life extensions going.
That's great, yes, and thanks. And as always, these discussions on sustainable development and industrialization are about trade-offs. And I guess that's just a message we need to keep on repeating for policymakers and the public, that there are trade-offs. And I always think our job is to try and reduce those trade-offs, so maximize the benefits and reduce the negative, the adverse impacts. And to that, now perhaps we can just focus a little bit on those countries, and you have touched on this, but I really want to explore how important is coal for some of these countries in the region. And two things come to mind. One, we're doing some work with a state bank in Indonesia, and interesting, that work we're doing is just transition. Mm-hmm. And of course, that is about transitioning out of coal in the case of Indonesia, and how do you manage that impact? And then it's on this podcast last week, we had an activist from Hwange in Zimbabwe. And what he's activating for is more on the transition in, which is they realize that in Zimbabwe, coal is very much there to stay, and there aren't many options for other sources of power. And he kind of harks back to better days in Hwange when there was more prosperity, and figuring out how his community become more involved. So how do you see coal being part of the development picture in some of these African countries, and what's the role of FutureCoal?
Well, for Africa I think Africa's going to have to figure out, and I think it's already made up its mind, which energy transition model it would like to follow. I think Europe has proven that it's a lot more difficult than the models, like the net zero models might suggest. The countries like Indonesia as a model is an interesting one that you bring it up because they, of course, have a massive critical mineral industry in their nickel industry, and for nickel smelting they need a lot of abundant affordable energy, and they are actually running coal-fired power stations to run those smelters. So they need to balance the business case for being part of the critical mineral supply chain with phasing out coal. So it's going to be that's a tricky one. I've actually done some work on reducing emissions in Indonesia as well in a previous role, and there are ways that they can improve stations. But I think a disappearance of coal-fired power with their abundance of a domestic resource, something very common with sub-Saharan Africa, their ever increasing fleet, as in terms of performance and the sort of modernity of their power stations. I mean, Vietnam's got far more advanced power stations in terms of coal-fired power than the UK has ever seen. So they are sitting on a very young coal fleet, so it's going to be around for several decades. In contrast, you've got the sub-Saharan African fleet, which is older. And so, what the argument is, what can we do with those? And FutureCoal's role will be to try and facilitate an exploration of the possible solutions that Africa can turn to. And that's just not looking at their power generation, but it's also looking at the mining solutions, the logistics solutions. And this is something that we're on the learning curve ourselves, but we are getting there, very, very quickly. And what we're seeing is there is scope to improve and clean up and make more emission-friendly coal-fired power technologies. You can do it with your existing plants. You have the infrastructure, you've got the grid, you've got the logistics all in place. You've got the rail, you've got the truck routes. Everything's there. So why make that disappear overnight? It's all about the solutions are there. So we think that Asia has been spearheading high efficiency power generation, for instance, for decades now, actually. Japan, China, India's going there. And again, we're seeing power stations that we've never seen in the UK and in many other parts of Europe as well that are so clean. Some of them are cleaner than gas turbines. And so there's no reason why sub-Saharan Africa can't maintain its coal logistics and its infrastructure, but add to that renewables, add to that perhaps gas technologies, but at the same time modernize its coal infrastructure as well. There are so many solutions, and it's about being inventive. It's about being creative. You don't have to follow the European route.
And for that to happen, it needs investment, of course. And as a kind of an outsider, and you just read the headlines in newspapers, I guess you could be forgiven to believe that the pressure to have investors opt out of coal or divest is as strong as ever. But as you pointed out, coal is still central to many economies. How are investors responding, and who are the new investors who are investing into this, I guess, the maintenance of a cleaner industry in coal?
Well, yeah, the traditional investors, especially the multilateral development banks, they had their fingers burned. I won't go down that alley. I think South Africa's, has experienced that, such as, the World Bank funding of power stations. So what's happened is, we've seen it's like a symbolic drift away from thermal coal investments. Not the same drift away from coke and coal investments. That's what's quite interesting, even amongst Western banks. But there is definitely this policy shift. In fact, many of these policy announcements from investors, in fact, came from investors that probably didn't have a very strong presence in the coal value chain anyway. So, many of these may have been, just reputational. So it is difficult, especially for the smaller operators amongst the African mining community, where they're seeing more expensive lending conditions. It is getting harder. I'm hearing that from the industry. Not many years ago, though, the Chinese were lending to coal power stations and to mining operations at very favourable rates and extremely favourable terms. With very few of the loopholes, or rather the holes to jump through, that your coal operators would need to do, especially amongst Western investors. So whether we see a re-emergence of Asian investment coming in to Africa, it will very much depend on what their lending policies are. Now, Japan is tied to the OECD, so their OECD lending policies, I'll be honest, is a bit on the biased side under the guidance rules on funding coal projects. But the Chinese also, in their Belt and Road program, also did a slight pullback on new coal investments. But what we haven't seen is a clear indication that they're saying no to investing in sustainable coal. Stewardship is what we call in FutureCoal. It's rather that modernisation I was talking about. It's about emissions solutions. It's about perhaps decarbonising and the mining sector, as well as other things like land rehabilitation, emissions reductions at the power stations, and effectively responsible coal consumption and production. So we think that there is a lot of interest out there. It's about communicating the solutions, and it's about still lending within their rules, but it will also be compatible with a much more sustainable pathway for sub-Saharan African coal. It's tricky in terms of the new funders. This is a question you really need to ask my CEO, because she's had a lot of conversations, confidential ones, with some very, very large international global finance houses, and they've been knocking on her door asking about where coal investment's going to head. So that is definitely a turning point. We are seeing a difference in sentiment. There's a lot more interest in carbon capture and storage. So decarbonising coal projects, people are saying that they're not averse to lending to that. It's about, again, getting the confidence, getting the risk reductions and understanding the risks of carbon capture and storage and how to reduce them, of which there are many solutions, which we're also seeing coming out of Europe as well as elsewhere. And so there's a lot of private lenders, a lot of private equity that wants to get involved. There are people out there who are quite freely admitting that they're willing to lend to coal. Sorry, that was my doorbell going, so I don't know if the sound is, and my dogs are barking.
I think you're good. So one thing you mentioned there, and I can't agree more, that you're seeing more and more Chinese investment, especially in the geopolitics of today, where China's, I guess, figuring out what its role is on the global stage. But you also mentioned that they have fewer conditions or loopholes that you have to jump through to get their investment. Does that include social safeguards and ESG standards? Or do you think those are now becoming more of a standard within the industry?
That's a good question. I think there are reports stating that there are looser terms, as in the Chinese would give, back when I did the research back in the 2000s, mid-2000s, that they would give credit on much better terms. And in fact, it was more the other way round, where Western investors might look at for instance, the human rights standards of a certain country, where China wouldn't judge a nation on those terms. It would go by a project basis, the merits and the mutual benefits of the respective partners. But ESG is definitely elevating, and that is definitely a way that is becoming standard practice, and if it hasn't already, it is standard practice today. And I'm seeing that amongst FutureCoal members as well. They're very careful practitioners in terms of safety and performance and environment as well. So these are all becoming standard practice. What's interesting is Europe, for instance, they are going to explore some much more stringent rules on ESG regarding chemical safety in critical mineral refining. And so there is a possibility that critical mining in Europe is not going to happen, nowhere near at the pace that their net zero pathways are demanding for those reasons. So on the ESG question, one has to say how stricter ESG standards do you need to have to a point where suddenly you lose that pathway to net zero and for the critical mineral supply chain? Do you want everything everywhere all at once? I think it's a term that I've seen somewhere. And this is something that the CEO of FutureCoal, Michel Manouk, will be discussing in much greater detail at the Indaba.
That's great. Look forward to hearing her presentation. I've got time, I think, for one more substantive topic, which is clean coal. And some would, as you said, consider that to be an oxymoron. But tell us a little bit about clean coal and what that means and what FutureCoal is doing to promote it.
Sure. Well, yes, clean coal certainly does sound like an oxymoron. It's not a term actually that we use, I'll be honest. It's, in fact, clean energy is a tricky one because as long as there is a human footprint on the natural environment, there is no such thing as green or clean. So we can look at everything and look at it critically. We can make coal cleaner. We can definitely do that from cradle to grave. We can make mining practices responsible so that what is extracted and dug is then restored to a natural habitat, sometimes even better than it was before. And I've visited many former mine sites where, it's quite staggering. You'd never know there was a mine there, whether it be in North America or Australia, and even many parts of Europe as well. And so the clean coal technology is a really interesting, or rather cleaner coal technology, or what we call sustainable coal, is the way forward to really minimize the impacts, not just environmental, not just emissions, because the technology is there. We can reduce emissions by up to 99%. Particulate matter, one of the key pollutants for respiratory problems in many parts of the world as a result of either crop burning, road transport, and coal-fired power, and any fossil fuel use. We can reduce that by 99.99%. The technology has been around for decades. Sulfur dioxides, an acid rain component, that can be reduced by 95 to 99%. NOx can be reduced by well over 80 to 90%. So we know that we can create those emission reductions. CO2, well, we know that we can get it anywhere between 85 and 99% reduction, depending on which technique you use and how you adopt it. But carbon capture and storage has been proven in the gas industry since the 1970s. In fact, I believe it was a process that was innovated in the early 1900s. So it's actually working around the world, and it's been proven. The Chinese right now are building and operating CCS plants on a coal-fired power station and hoping to capture 1.5 million tons of CO2 every year. So these are really exciting ways forward. And the Chinese are also ensuring that this is an exportable technology. They're not making sure, they're not just designing it just so it fits onto Chinese power plants. There's some really, really exciting avenues. And so effectively, sustainable, responsible coal is really what we're talking about, is whatever we did in the past and whatever we're doing today, let's make sure that the way we exploit coal or any natural resource, including gas, oil, all the critical minerals needed for the renewable energies, is done responsibly. It's done to the highest possible standard, but also it has to be balanced with the acceleration and pace we need to try and meet those climate targets as well. And when we think that 80% of global energy right now still comes from fossil fuels and has remained almost unchanged since the 1990s, now I think we're seeing, going back to actually your first question, we're seeing signals that the solutions have to be fossil related. They have to be fossil fuel solutions alongside nuclear, alongside renewables. Otherwise, we're just not going to meet those goals that we're all aspiring for.
Yeah, so we can be ambitious, but we've also got to get real on some of these things and figure out how we can apply technology and our ample innovation to set things on the right path. Look, it's been a real pleasure talking to you, Paul. Thanks very much. You're obviously extremely knowledgeable about this and just the right person in the right job. Maybe I could finish on a question about the future. Maybe two questions, in fact. One is, looking ahead, 5 years or so in success, what would success be in your, which I have to say, quite a difficult task to change points of view and perceptions about coal? What do you hope to get? And then, because we're going into the Indaba and Africa in particular, how do you hope that African nations will be benefiting from coal in the next 5 or 10 years?
That's a question which may have an answer that people will think, because really success will come from metrics and outcomes. And you may not see the successes of a modern, clean and a cleaner pathway for coal. And I'll tell you why. If you keep the lights on, nobody notices. For instance, in the United States recently, where effectively compared to Storm Uri back in 2021, when there were blackouts and there was catastrophes, this time round there wasn't the same problems. There was some wind power coming out, by the way, but coal's actually stepped up. Okay, it kept the lights on. It enabled society, enabled commerce, enabled households to function almost as normal. Obviously, what was going on outside was quite something, but you won't notice when your normal life actually means you've got electrons coming through and powering your laptop and charging your phone and powering your appliances, and so it's going to be almost an invisible outcome, and you won't. And hopefully, maybe in 5 years' time, you'll see less risk, almost no risk, let's hope, of any chance of load shedding, and it will become part and parcel. You won't have to think about when or where you can activate your Wi-Fi in sub-Saharan Africa. Miners and industrial processes won't have to think about where the next kilowatt hour, megawatt, or gigawatt hour is going to be available for them to respond to their markets and respond to their customers. So I think hopefully what you'll feel in 5 years' time is business as usual will not feel like business as usual today. It will be more productive. It will be more comfortable, and it will be cleaner as well. I think if with tweaks and investments and ongoing investments in improving the coal value chain, you'll see improvements all the way down the line.
That's great. And yeah, I think that's then a good message to end on. This is about kind of energy security, which we do take for granted. So I think you're right to talk about what we feel, because we don't often think about where our energy comes from. And for sure, coal is going to continue to be important in many countries, if not across the world. Thank you once again to our speaker, Paul Baruya, for joining us today. To our listeners, please check out the rest of the special series of Mining Indaba podcasts on the TDI Suits and Boots podcast channel. I look forward to seeing you all next week at the Mining in Indaba event, where you can hear more from Paul and his CEO, Michel, and his future colleagues on this topic. I'm Assheton Carter, and thank you for listening.